Stolen Legacy by G.M James. Read by JBenzDaLight. The Egyptian Origins of Western Philosophy. Introduction. Characteristics of Greek Philosophy. The term Greek philosophy, to begin with, is a misnomer, for there is no such philosophy in existence. The ancient Egyptians had developed a very complex religious system called the Mysteries, which was also the first system of salvation. As such, it regarded the human body as a prison house of the soul, which could be liberated from its bodily impediments through the disciplines of the arts and sciences and advance from the level of a mortal to that of a god. This was the notion of the summum bonum, or greatest good, to which all men must aspire, and it also became the basis of all ethical concepts. The Egyptian mystery system was also a secret order, and membership was gained by initiation and a pledge to secrecy. The teaching was graded and delivered orally to the neophyte, and under these circumstances of secrecy, the Egyptians developed secret systems of writing and teaching, and forbade their initiates from writing what they had learnt. After nearly 5,000 years of prohibition against the Greeks, they were permitted to enter Egypt for the purpose of their education. First through the Persian invasion, and secondly through the invasion of Alexander the Great. From the 6th century BC, therefore, to the death of Aristotle, 322 BC, the Greeks made the best of their chance to learn all they could about Egyptian culture. Most students received instructions directly from the Egyptian priests, but after the invasion by Alexander the Great, the royal temples and libraries were plundered and pillaged, and Aristotle's school converted the library at Alexandria into a research center. There is no wonder, then, that the production of the unusually large number of books ascribed to Aristotle has proved a physical impossibility for any single man within a single lifetime. The history of Aristotle's life has done him far more harm than good, since it carefully avoids any statement relating to his visit to Egypt, either on his own account or in company with Alexander the Great. When he invaded Egypt, this silence of history at once throws doubt upon the life and achievements of Aristotle. He is said to have spent 20 years under the tutorship of Plato, who was regarded as a philosopher, yet he graduated as the greatest of scientists of antiquity. Two questions might be asked. A. How could Plato teach Aristotle what he himself did not know? And B. Why should Aristotle spend 20 years under a teacher from whom he could learn nothing? This bit of history sounds incredible. Again, in order to avoid suspicion over the extraordinary number of books ascribed to Aristotle, history tells us that Alexander the Great gave him a large sum of money to get the books. Here again, the history sounds incredible, and three statements must here be made. A. In order to purchase books on science, they must have been in circulation so as to enable Aristotle to secure them. B. If the books were in circulation before Aristotle purchased them, and since he is not supposed to have visited Egypt at all, then the books in question must have been circulated among Greek philosophers. C. If circulated among Greek philosophers, then we would expect the subject matter of such books to have been known before Aristotle's time, and consequently he could not be credited either with producing them or introducing new ideas of science. Another point of considerable interest to be accounted for was the attitude of the Athenian government towards this so-called Greek philosophy, which are regarded as foreign in origin and treated it accordingly. Only a brief study of history is necessary to show that Greek philosophers were undesirable citizens, who throughout the period of their investigations were victims of relentless persecution at the hands of the Athenian government. Anaxagoras was imprisoned and exiled, Socrates was executed, Plato was sold into slavery, and Aristotle was indicted and exiled, while the earliest of them all, Pythagoras, was expelled from Croton in Italy. Can we imagine the Greeks making such an about turn as to claim the very teachings which they had at first persecuted and openly rejected? Certainly they knew they were usurping what they never produced. And as we enter step by step into our study, the greater do we discover evidence which leads us to the conclusion that Greek philosophers were not the authors of Greek philosophy, but the Egyptian priests and hierophants. Aristotle died in 322 BC. Not many years after he had been aided by Alexander the Great to secure the largest quantity of scientific books from the royal libraries and temples of Egypt. In spite, however, of such great intellectual treasure, the death of Aristotle marked the death of philosophy among the Greeks, who did not seem to possess the natural ability to advance these sciences. Consequently, history informs us that the Greeks were forced to make a study of ethics, which they also borrowed from the Egyptian summum bonum, or greatest good. The two other Athenian philosophers must be mentioned here. I mean Socrates and Plato, who also became famous in history as philosophers and great thinkers. Every schoolboy believes that when he hears or reads the command, know thyself, he is hearing or reading words which were uttered by Socrates. But the truth is that the Egyptian temples carried inscriptions on the outside addressed to neophytes, and among them was the injunction, know thyself. Socrates copied these words from the Egyptian temples and was not the author. All mystery temples inside and outside of Egypt carry such inscriptions, just like the weekly bulletins of our modern churches. Similarly, every schoolboy believes that when he hears or reads the names of the four cardinal virtues, he is hearing or reading names of virtues determined by Plato. Nothing has been more misleading, for the Egyptian mystery system contained 10 virtues, and from this source Plato copied what had been called the four cardinal virtues: justice, wisdom, temperance, and courage. It is indeed surprising how, for centuries, the Greeks have been praised by the Western world for intellectual accomplishments which belong without a doubt to the Egyptians or the peoples of North Africa. Another noticeable characteristic of Greek philosophy is the fact that most of the Greek philosophers used the teachings of Pythagoras as their model, and consequently they have introduced nothing new in the field of philosophy. Included in the Pythagorean system, we find the doctrines of A. Opposites, B. Harmony, C. Fire, D. Mind, since it is composed of fire atoms, E. Immortality, expressed as transmigration of souls, F. The summum bonum, or the purpose of philosophy. And these, of course, are reflected in the systems of Heraclitus, Parmenides, Democritus, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. The next thing that is peculiar about Greek philosophy is its use in literature. The Egyptian mystery system was the first secret order of history, and the publication of its teachings was strictly prohibited. This explains why initiates like Socrates did not commit to writing their philosophy, and why the Babylonians and Chaldeans, who were very closely associated with them, also refrained from publishing those teachings. We can at once see how easy it was for an ambitious and even envious nation to claim a body of unwritten knowledge which would make them great in the eyes of the primitive world. The absurdity, however, is easily recognized when we remember that the Greek language was used to translate several systems of teachings which the Greeks could not succeed in claiming. Such were the translation of Hebrew scriptures into Greek, called the Septuagint, and the translation of the Christian Gospels, Acts, and the Epistles in Greek, still called the Greek New Testament. It is only the unwritten philosophy of the Egyptians translated into Greek that has met with such an unhappy fate, a legacy stolen by the Greeks. On account of reasons already given, I have been compelled to handle the subject matter of this book in the way it has been handled, namely A, with the frequency of repetition, because it is the method of Greek philosophy to use a common principle to explain several different doctrines, and B, the quotation and analysis of doctrines, because it is the object of this book to establish the Egyptian origin, and this cannot be so satisfactorily done if the doctrines are not presented. Greek philosophy is somewhat of a drama, whose chief actors were Alexander the Great, Aristotle and his successors in the Peripatetic school, and the Roman Emperor Justinian. Alexander invaded Egypt and captured the royal library at Alexandria and plundered it. Aristotle made a library of his own with plundered books, while his school occupied the building and used it as a research center. Finally, Justinian, the Roman emperor, abolished the temples and schools of philosophy, i.e., another name for the Egyptian mysteries which the Greeks claimed as their product, and on account of which they had been falsely praised and honored for centuries by the world as its greatest philosophers and thinkers. This contribution to civilization was really and truly made by the Egyptians and the African continent, but not by the Greeks of the European continent. We sometimes wonder why the people of African descent find themselves in such a social plight as they do, but the answer is plain enough. Had it not been for this drama of Greek philosophy and its actors, the African continent would have had a different reputation and would have enjoyed a status of respect among the nations of the world. This unfortunate position of the African continent and its peoples appears to be the result of misrepresentation upon which the structure of race prejudice has been built, i.e., the historical world opinion that the African continent is backward, that its people are backward, and that their civilization is also backward. Finally, the dishonesty in the movement of the publication of a Greek philosophy becomes very glaring when we refer to the fact purposely that by calling the theorem of the square of the hypotenuse the Pythagorean theorem, it has concealed the truth for centuries from the world, who ought to know that the Egyptians taught Pythagoras and the Greeks what mathematics they knew. I want to mention here that among the many books which I found helpful in my present work are The Intellectual Adventure of Man and The Egyptian Religion by Professor Henry Frankfurt and The Mediterranean World in Ancient Times by Professor Eva Sanford. George G.M. James. The aims of this book. The aim of the book is to establish better race relations in the world by revealing a fundamental truth concerning the contribution of the African continent to civilization. It must be borne in mind that the first lesson in the humanities is to make a people aware of their contribution to civilization, and the second lesson is to teach them about other civilizations. By this dissemination of the truth about the civilization of individual peoples, a better understanding among them and a proper appraisal of each other should follow. This notion is based upon the notion of the great mastermind. Ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. Consequently, the book is an attempt to show that the true authors of Greek philosophy were not the Greeks, but the people of North Africa, commonly called the Egyptians, and the praise and honor falsely given to the Greeks for centuries belonged to the people of North Africa, and therefore to the African continent. Consequently, this theft of the African legacy by the Greeks led to the erroneous world opinion that the African continent has made no contribution to civilization, and that its people are naturally backward. This is the misrepresentation that has become the basis of race prejudice, which has affected all people of color. For centuries, the world has been misled about the original source of the arts and sciences. For centuries, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle have been falsely idolized as models of intellectual greatness. And for centuries, the African continent has been called the Dark Continent because Europe coveted the honor of transmitting to the world the arts and sciences. I am happy to be able to bring this information to the attention of the world so that on one hand, all races and creeds might know the truth and free themselves from those prejudices which have corrupted human relations, and on the other hand, that the people of African origin might be emancipated from their serfdom of inferiority complex and enter upon a new era of freedom in which they would feel like free men with full human rights and privileges. Chapter 1. Greek philosophy is stolen Egyptian philosophy. 1. The teachings of the Egyptian mysteries reached other lands many centuries before it reached Athens. According to history, Pythagoras, after receiving his training in Egypt, returned to his native island, Samos, where he established his order for a short time, after which he migrated to Croton, 540 BC, in southern Italy, where his order grew to enormous proportions, until his final expulsion from that country. We are also told that Thales, 640 BC, who had also received his education in Egypt, and his associates Anaximander and Anaximenes were natives of Ionia in Asia Minor, which was a stronghold of the Egyptian mystery schools, which they carried on. Sanford's The Mediterranean World, page 195 to 205. Similarly, we are told that Xenophanes, 576 BC, Parmenides, Zeno, and Melusis were also natives of Ionia, and that they migrated to Elia in Italy and established themselves and spread the teachings of the mysteries. In like manner, we are informed that Heraclitus, 530 BC, Empedocles, Anaxagoras, and Democritus were also natives of Ionia who were interested in physics. Hence, in tracing the course of the so-called Greek philosophy, we find that Ionian students, after obtaining their education from the Egyptian priests, returned to their native island, while some of them migrated to different parts of Italy, where they established themselves. Consequently, history makes it clear that the surrounding neighbors of Egypt had all become familiar with the teachings of Egyptian mysteries many centuries before the Athenians, who in 399 BC sentenced Socrates to death. Zeller's History of Philosophy, page 112, 127, 170 to 172, and subsequently caused Plato and Aristotle to flee for their lives from Athens because philosophy was something foreign and unknown to them. For this same reason, we would expect either the Ionians or the Italians to exert their prior claim to philosophy, since it made contact with them long before it did with the Athenians, who were always its greatest enemies until Alexander's conquest of Egypt, which provided for Aristotle free access to the library of Alexandria. The Ionians and Italians made no attempt to claim the authorship of philosophy because they were well aware that the Egyptians were the true authors. On the other hand, after the death of Aristotle, his Athenian pupils, without the authority of the state, undertook to compile a history of philosophy, recognized at that time as the Sophia or wisdom of the Egyptians, which had become current and traditional in the ancient world, which compilation because it was produced by pupils who had belonged to Aristotle's school. Later history has erroneously called Greek philosophy, in spite of the fact that the Greeks were its greatest enemies and persecutors, and had persistently treated it as a foreign innovation. For this reason, the so-called Greek philosophy is stolen Egyptian philosophy, which first spread to Ionia, thence to Italy, and thence to Athens. And it must be remembered that at this remote period of Greek history, i.e., Thales to Aristotle 640 BC to 322 BC, the Ionians were not Greek citizens, but at first Egyptian subjects and later Persian subjects. Zeller's History of Philosophy, page 37, 46, 58, 66 to 83, 112, 127, 170 to 172. William Turner's History of Philosophy, page 34, 39, 45, 53. Rogers' Student History of Philosophy, page 15. B. D. Alexander's History of Philosophy, page 13 and 21. Sanford's The Mediterranean World, page 157, 195 to 205. A brief sketch of the ancient Egyptian empire would also make it clear that Asia Minor or Ionia was the ancient land of the Hittites, who were not known by any other name in ancient days. According to Diodorus and Manetho, high priest in Egypt, two columns were found at Nyassa, Arabia, one of the goddess Isis and the other of the god Osiris, on the latter of which the god declared that he had led an army into India, to the sources of the Danube, and as far as the ocean. This means, of course, that the Egyptian Empire, at a very early date, included not only the islands of the Aegean Sea and Ionia, but also extended to the extremities of the east. We are also informed that Senusert I, during the 12th dynasty, i.e., about 1900 BC, conquered the whole sea coast of India, beyond the Ganges to the Eastern Ocean. He is also said to have included the Cyclades and a great part of Europe in his conquests. Secondly, the Amarna letters found in the government offices of the Egyptian king Akhenaten testify to the fact that the Egyptian empire had extended to Western Asia, Syria, and Palestine, and that for centuries Egyptian power had been supreme in the ancient world. This was in the 18th dynasty, i.e., about 1500 BC. We are also told that during the reign of Thutmose III, the dominion of Egypt extended not only along the coast of Palestine, but also from Nubia to northern Asia. Bredstedt's Conquest of Civilization, page 84, Diodorus, 128, Manetho, Strabo, Daciarus, John Kengrich's Ancient Egypt, Volume 1. 2. The authorship of the individual doctrines is extremely doubtful. As one attempts to read the history of Greek philosophy, one discovers a complete absence of essential information concerning the early life and training of the so-called Greek philosophers, from Thales to Aristotle. No writer or historian professes to know anything about their early education. All they tell us about them consists of a doubtful date, and place of birth, and b, their doctrines. But the world is left to wonder who they were and from what source they got their early education, and would naturally expect that men who rose to the position of a teacher among relatives, friends, and associates would be well known not only by them, but by the whole community. On the contrary, men who might well be placed among the earliest teachers in history, who had grown up from childhood to manhood and had taught pupils, are represented as unknown, being without any domestic, social, or early educational traces. This is unbelievable, and yet it is a fact that the history of Greek philosophy has presented to the world a number of men whose lives it knows little or nothing about, but expects the world to accept them as the true authors of the doctrines which are alleged to be theirs. In the absence of essential evidence, the world hesitates to recognize them as such, because the truth of this whole matter of Greek philosophy points to a very different direction. The book on nature, entitled Periphythos, was the common name under which Greek students interested in nature study wrote. The earliest copy is said to date back to the 6th century BC, and it is customary to refer to the remnants of Periphythos as the fragments. William Turner's History of Philosophy, page 62. We do not believe that genuine initiates produced the book on nature, in connection with which the philosophical schools conducted their work. Egypt was the center of the body of ancient wisdom and knowledge, religious, philosophical, and scientific, spread to other lands through student initiates. Such teachings remained for generations and centuries in the form of tradition, until the conquest of Egypt by Alexander the Great, and the movement of Aristotle and his school to compile Egyptian teaching and claim it as Greek philosophy. Ancient Mysteries by C.H. Val, page 16. Consequently, as a source of authority of authorships, Periphythos is of little value, if any, since history mentions only 4 names as authors of it, namely Anaximander, Heraclitus, Parmenides, and Anaxagoras, and asks the world to accept their authorship of philosophy because Theophrastus, Sextus, Proclus, Simplicius of the school at Alexandria are said to have preserved small remnants of it, the fragments. If Periphythos is the criterion to the authorship of Greek philosophy, then it falls short in its purpose by a long way, since only four philosophers are alleged to have written this book, and to have remnants of their work. According to this idea, all the other philosophers who failed to write Periphythos and to have remnants of it also failed to write Greek philosophy. This is the reductio ad absurdum to which Periphythos leads us. The schools of philosophy, Chaldean, Greek, and Persian, were part of the ancient mystery system of Egypt. They were conducted in secrecy according to the demands of the Osiriaca, whose teachings became common to all the schools. In keeping with the demands for secrecy, the writing and publication of teachings were strictly forbidden, and consequently, initiates who had developed satisfactorily in their training and had been advanced to the rank of master or teacher refrained from publishing the teachings of the mysteries or philosophy. Consequently, any publication of philosophy could not have come from the pen of the original philosophers themselves, but either from their close friends who knew their views, as in the case of Pythagoras and Socrates, or from interested persons who made a record of those philosophical teachings that had become popular opinion and tradition. There is no wonder then that in the absence of original authorship, history has had to resort to the strategy of accepting Aristotle's opinion as the sole authority in determining the authorship of Greek philosophy. Introduction to Alfred Weber's History of Philosophy. It is for these reasons that the great doubt surrounds the so-called Greek authorship of philosophy. William Turner's History of Philosophy, page 35, 39, 47, 53, 62, 79, 210, 211, 627. Ancient Mysteries by C. H. Val, page 16. Theophrastus, Fragment 2, Apudiel, Introduction to Alfred Weber's History of Philosophy. Number 3. The chronology of Greek philosophers is mere speculation. History knows nothing about the early life and training of the Greek philosophers, and this is true not only of the pre-Socratic philosophers, but also of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, who appear in history about the age of 18 and begin to teach at 40. As a body of men, they were undesirable to the state, personae non grata, and were consequently persecuted and driven into hiding and secrecy. Under such circumstances, they kept no records of their activities, and this was done in order to conceal their identity. After the conquest of Egypt by Alexander the Great and the seizure and looting of the royal library at Alexandria, Aristotle's plan to usurp Egyptian philosophy was subsequently carried out by members of his school. Theophrastus, Andronicus of Rhodes, and Eudemus, who soon found themselves confronted with the problem of a chronology for a history of philosophy. Introduction of Zeller's History of Philosophy, page 13. Throughout this effort, there has been much speculation concerning the date of birth of philosophers, who the public knew very little about. As early as the 3rd century BC, 274 to 194 BC, Eratosthenes, a Stoic, drew up a chronology of Greek philosophers, and in the 2nd century BC, 140, Apollodorus also drew up another. The effort continued, and in the 1st century BC, 60 to 70 BC, Andronicus, the 11th head of the Peripatetic school, also drew up another. This difficulty continued throughout the early centuries and has come down to the present time, for it appears that all modern writers on Greek philosophy are unable to agree on the dates that should be assigned to the nativity of the philosophers. The only exception appears to occur with reference to the three Athenian philosophers, i.e., Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, the date of whose nativity is believed to be certain, and concerning which there is general agreement among historians. However, when we come to deal with the pre-Socratic philosophers, we are confronted with confusion and uncertainty, and a few examples would serve to illustrate the untrustworthy nature of the chronology of Greek philosophers. 1. Diogenes Laertius places the birth of Thales at 640 BC, while William Turner's History of Philosophy places it at 620 BC. that of Frank Tilly at 624 BC, that of A.K. Rogers at early in the 6th century BC, and that of W.G. Teneman at 600 BC. Number 2. Diogenes Laertius places the birth of Anaxagoras Anaximus Anaximandus at 546 BC, while W. Wildebrand places it at the 6th century BC, that of Frank Tilly at 588 BC, that of B.D. Alexander at 560 BC, while that of A.K. Rogers at the 6th century BC. 3. Pomardius is credited by Diogenes as being born at 500 BC, while Fuller, Tilly, and Rogers omit a date of birth because they say it is unknown. 4. Zeller places the birth of Xenophanes at 576 BC, while Diogenes gives 570 BC, and the majority of the other historians declare that the date of birth is unknown. With references to Zeno, Diogenes, who does not know. Number 5. With reference to Zeno, Diogenes, who does not know the date of his birth, says that he flourished between BC 464 to 460, 464 to 460, while William Turner places it at 490 BC, like Frank Tilly and B.D. Alexander, while Fuller, A.K. Rogers, and W.G. Teneman declare it is unknown. Number 6. With references to Heraclitus, Zeller makes the following suppositions. If he died in 475 BC, and if he was 60 years old when he died, then he must have been born in 535 BC. Similarly, Diogenes supposes that he flourished between BC 504 to 500, and while William Turner places his birth at 530 BC, Wildebrand places it at 536 BC, and Fuller and Teneman declare that he flourished in 500 BC. Number 7. With reference to Pythagoras, Zeller, who does not know the date of his birth, supposes that it occurred between the years 580 to 570 BC, and while Diogenes also supposes that it occurred between the years 582 to 500 BC. William Turner, Fuller, Rogers, and Teneman declare that it is unknown. Number 8. With reference to Empedocles, while Diogenes places his birth at 484 BC, Turner, Wildebrand, Fuller, B.D. Alexander, and Teneman place it at 490 BC, while A.K. Rogers and others declare it is unknown. Number 9. With reference to Anaxagoras, while Zeller and Diogenes place his birth at 500 BC, William Turner, A.G. Fuller, and Frank Tilly agree with them, while Alexander places it at 450 BC, and A.K. Rogers and others declare it is unknown. 10. With reference to Leucippus, all historians seem to be of the opinion that he has never existed. 11. Socrates, 469 to 399 BC, Plato, 427 to 347 BC, and Aristotle, 384 to 322 BC, are the only three philosophers the dates of whose nativity and death do not seem to have led to speculation among historians. But the reason for this uniformity is probably due to the fact that they were Athenians and had been indicted by the Athenian government, who would naturally have investigated them and kept a record of their cases. A.K. Rogers' History of Philosophy, page 104. And B. It must be noted from the preceding comparative study of the chronology of Greek philosophers that A. The variation in dates points to speculation. B. The pre-Socratic philosophers were unknown because they were foreigners to the Athenian government and probably never existed. C. It follows that both the pre-Socratic philosophers, together with Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, were persecuted by the Athenian government for introducing foreign doctrines into Athens. D. In consequence of these facts, any subsequent claim by the Greeks to the ownership or authorship of the same doctrines which they had rejected and persecuted must be regarded as a usurpation. 4. The compilation of the history of Greek philosophy was the plan of Aristotle executed by his school. When Aristotle decided to compile a history of Greek philosophy, he must have made known his wishes to his pupils Theophrastus and Eudemus. For no sooner did he produce his metaphysics than Theophrastus followed him by publishing 18 books on the doctrines of the physicists. Similarly, after Theophrastus had published his doctrines of the physicists, Eudemus produced separate histories of arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and also theology. This was an amazing start because of the large number of scientific books and the wide range of subjects treated. This situation has rightly aroused the suspicion of the world as it questions the source of these scientific works. Since Theophrastus and Eudemus were students under Aristotle at the same time, and since the conquest of Egypt by Alexander the Great made the Egyptian library at Alexandria available to the Greeks for research, then it must be expected that the three men, Aristotle, who was a close friend of Alexander, Theophrastus, and Eudemus, not only did research at the Alexandrian library at the same time, but must also have helped themselves to books, which enabled them to follow each other so closely in the production of scientific works. William Turner's History of Philosophy, page 158 to 159, which was either a portion of the war to be taken from the Library of Compilations from them. Note that Aristotle's works reveal the signs of note-taking and that Theophrastus and Eudemus were pupils attending Aristotle's school at the same time. William Turner's History of Philosophy, page 127. Just here it might be as well to mention the names of Aristotle's pupils who took an active part in promoting the movement towards the compilation of a history of Greek philosophy. Theophrastus of Lesbos, 371 to 286 BC, who succeeded Aristotle as head of the Pathetic school. As elsewhere mentioned, he is said to have produced 18 books on the doctrines of physicists. Who were these physicists? Greek or Egyptian? Just think of it. B. Eudemus of Rhodes, a contemporary of Theophrastus with whom he also attended Aristotle's school. He is said to have produced histories of arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and theology, as elsewhere mentioned. What was the source of the data of the histories of these sciences, which must have taken any nation thousands of years to develop? Greece or Egypt? Just think of it. C. Andronicus of Rhodes, an eclectic of Aristotle's school and editor of his works BC 70. These men's works, together with Aristotle's Metaphysics, which contained a critical summary of the doctrines of all preceding philosophers, seem to form the nucleus of a compilation of what has been called the history of Greek philosophy. Zeller's History of Greek Philosophy, Introduction Part, page 7 to 14. The next movement was the organization of an association called the Learned Study of Aristotle's Writings, whose members were Theophrastus and Andronicus, who were both closely connected with the school of Aristotle. The function of this association was to identify the literature and doctrines of philosophy with their so-called respective authors. And in order to accomplish this, the alumni of Aristotle's school and its friends were encouraged to enter upon a research for Aristotle's works and to write commentaries on them. In addition to this, the Learned Association also encouraged research for the recovery of what has been named fragments or remnants of a book, which is supposed to have once existed and to have borne the common title Periphysos, i.e., concerning nature. Here again, those who went out in search of Periphysos or its remnants were the alumni of Aristotle's school and its friends. But their efforts to establish authorship was a failure. A. Theophrastus found only 2 lines of Periphysos supposed to have been written by Anaximander. B. Sextus and Proclus of the 5th century A.D. and Simplicius of the 6th century A.D. are said to have found a copy of Periphysos supposed to have been produced by Parmenius. C. In addition, the name of Simplicius is also associated with a copy of Periphysos, which is supposed to have been produced by Anaxagoras. So much for Periphysos and the fragments, and so much for the attempt of the Learned Association for the study of Aristotle's work, which has failed because of lack of evidence, as has elsewhere been pointed out. The recovery of 2 copies and 2 lines of Periphysos is not proof that all Greek philosophers wrote Periphysos, or even that the names assigned to them were their bona fide authors. It certainly would appear that the object of the learned association was to beat Aristotle's own drum and dance. It was Aristotle's idea to compile a history of philosophy, and it was Aristotle's school and its alumni that carried out the idea, we are told. Chapter 2. So-called Greek philosophy was alien to the Greeks and their conditions of life. The period of Greek philosophy, 640 to 322 BC, was a period of internal and external wars, and was therefore unsuitable for producing philosophers. History supports the fact that from the time of Thales to the time of Aristotle, the Greeks were victims of internal disunion on the one hand, while on the other, they lived in constant fear of invasion from the Persians, who were a common enemy to the city-states. Consequently, when they were not fighting with one another, they found themselves busy fighting the Persians, who soon dominated them and became their masters. From the 6th century BC, the territory from the coast of Asia Minor to the Indus Valley became united under the single power of Persia, whose central territory, Iran, has survived as a national unit to the present day. Persian expansion was like a nightmare to the Greeks, who dreaded the Persians on account of their invulnerable navy, and organized themselves into leagues and confederacies in order to resist their enemy. C. 12, page 195, Sanford's Mediterranean World. There are three sources which throw light on the chaotic and troublesome conditions of this period in Greek history. A. The Persian conquest. B. The leagues. And C. Peloponnesian Wars. A. The Persian conquest. After the Persians had conquered the Ionians, possibly ancient Hittites, and made them their subjects, Polycrates, 539 to 524 BC, seized the island of Samos and made it a famous city. Sanford's Mediterranean World, c. 9. Between 499 and 494 BC, the Ionians revolted against the Persians, who defeated them at Lad, while Cyprus and Miletus were also captured. Sanford's Mediterranean World, c. 12. In the summer of 490 BC, Greek and Persian forces met at Marathon, but after a hand-to-hand fight, both belligerents withdrew, only to prepare stronger forces in order to renew the conflict. Accordingly, after 10 years had elapsed, a Hellenic league was organized against the Persians, and the Spartan king Leonidas was sent with an army to hold the pass at Thermopylae until the fleet should win a decisive victory. C. 12, page 202, Sanford's Mediterranean World. Accordingly, during the month of August 481 BC, Persian ships under the command of Xerxes anchored in the Gulf of Pagus, while the Greeks anchored off Cape Artemisium. Both sides awaited a favorable opportunity to attack. The Persians began to force the pass, while simultaneously one of their detachments was secretly aided by a Greek traitor along a steep mountain pass to the rear of the Greek position. Having been taken by surprise, the Greek guards immediately withdrew without resistance. The Spartans who were guarding Thermopylae were all slain and the pass captured by the Persians. Sanford's Mediterranean World, c. 12, part 202. Having been defeated at Thermopylae, the Greeks withdrew to Salamis, where again they encountered a naval engagement with the Persians. It was late in September 481 BC, and the result was a wanton destruction of ships on both sides, without any decision. Both belligerents withdrew, the Persians to Thessaly and the Greeks to Attica. Sanford's Mediterranean World, c. 12, page 203. With the persistent aim of freedom from Persian domination, Athens, together with the island and coast cities of the Aegean and Ionia, renewed their resistance of Persian rule. This was the Confederacy of Delos, which undertook several naval engagements, but with little or no success. In 467 BC, the Battle of Eurymedion River was fought and lost with a great number of ships. 18 years later, 449 BC, another naval engagement took place off the island of Cyprus, but again without decision, and consequently Persian sovereignty over the Greeks remained. Sanford's Mediterranean World, chapter 12, page 205. In the meantime, Sparta, under the terms of the Treaty of Miletus, 413 BC, obtained subsidies from Persia for naval construction on condition that she recognized Persian sovereignty over the Ionians and their allies. This was done by Sparta as a threat to Athenian ambitions. However, it was not long after the Treaty of Miletus that the Greeks themselves submitted to the authority and dominance of the Persians. During the winter 387 to 386 BC, the individual Ionian cities signed the peace terms of the Persian king and finally accepted Persian rule. This treaty was negotiated by a Spartan envoy who was authorized by the Persian king to enforce its provisions. Sanford's Mediterranean World, chapter 13 and 15, page 225 and 255. B. The Leagues. Apart from the resistance of a common foe, the Persians, a study of the functions of the leagues, reveals the enmity and spirit of aggression which were characteristic of the relationship which existed between the Greek city-states themselves. Accordingly, in 505 BC, the Peloponnesian states signed treaties among themselves, pledging warfare against Sparta, who had absorbed them under her influence. Meanwhile, Aristogoras revived the Ionian League, 499 to 494 BC, to resist Persian aggression, and friendship between Athens and Aegina was restored by the Hellenic League, 481 BC, which was afterward converted into the Confederacy of Delos, 478 BC, as mentioned elsewhere. In like manner, Thebes also fell in line with the general temper of the age and organized the Boeotian League, a federation of city-states, for self-protection and aggression. Sanford's Mediterranean World, chapter 9, page 150, chapter 12, page 201. In 377 BC, a second Athenian confederacy was organized, but this was to frustrate the aims of the Lacedaemonians and to compel them to respect the right of the Athenians and their allies. Sanford's Mediterranean World, chapter 15, page 260. Likewise, in 290 BC, the Etonian League, made up of the states of central Greece, gained control of Delphi and frequently violated Achaean rights in the Peloponnesus, while in 225 BC, Antigonus Doson organized another Hellenic League with the purpose of obstructing the ambitions of Sparta and her Aetolian allies. Sanford's Mediterranean World, chapter 18, page 317 and 319. W.H. Couch's History of Greece, page 206 to 209. Chapter 11, Botsford and Robinson's Hellenic History, page 115 to 121, 127 to 142. T.B. Bury's History of Greece, page 216 to 229, 240 to 241, 259 to 269, 471 to 472. The Tutorial History of Greece by W.J. Woodhouse, chapter 18, 20, page 20 and 21, chapter 18, chapter 20 and chapter 21. C. The Peloponnesian Wars, 460 to 445 BC and 431 to 421 BC. Owing to the ambitions of Athens to dominate the Ionians and other neighboring peoples, Pericles launched a campaign of alliances and conquests extending from Thessaly to Argos and from Euboea to Naupactus, Axae, and the chief islands of the Ionian Sea. The net results were as follows. A. Athens established alliances with Boeotia, Phocis, and Locris in spite of Sparta's opposition. B. In 456 BC, Aegina was captured and made tributary. C. In 450 BC, Athens failed in her attempt to invade Corinth. D. In 451, friendship between Athens and Sparta was restored through the instrumentality of Cimon, on the condition that Athenian alliance with Argos was dissolved. E. In 447 BC, the exiled oligarchs of Thebes defeated the Athenians at Coronea and re-established the Boeotian League under Theban leadership. F. In 445 BC, the 30 Years' Peace was signed, and after the revolts of Euboea and Megara, Sparta invaded Attica and Pericles sued for peace. Athens lost all her continental holdings. Sanford's Mediterranean World, Chapter 13, page 220. The Second Peloponnesian War, 431 to 421 BC, like that of the first, arose through a general spirit of rebellion among the Greek city-states against Athenian imperialism, Sparta being the chief enemy. The net results were as follows. A. In 435 BC, war between Corcyra and Corinth, Corcyra being aided by Athens. B. In 432 BC, 1. Athens blockaded Plodidia because she refused to dismantle her southern walls and dismissed her Corinthian magistrates. 2. Megara was excluded from the Greek markets in order to reduce her to subjection. 3. The Peloponnesian League planned war against Athens and Boeotia. Phocis and Locris were to fight against Athens, Corcyra, and a few northern states. C. In 431 BC, 1. Thebes attacked Plataea, and while a Peloponnesian army occupied Attica, the Athenian fleet raided Peloponnesus. 2. Pericles, being unable to defend Attica adequately, transferred the civil population every spring to the area between the walls of Athens and the Periphas. In the meantime, the Athenian fleet operated against Potidæa, the Peloponnesian coast, and Corinthian commerce. D. In 428 BC, 1. Mytilene and all the cities of Lesbos revolted. 2. A brutal massacre of oligarchs took place at Corcyra. E. In 425 BC, 1. A Laconian force at Pylos was captured and a fort was established through Demosthenes in Cleon. 2. Sisera and other stations were fortified against the Peloponnesians. 3. Amphipolis was captured by Brasidas, a Spartan, who had instigated rebellion among the Athenian allies, and after Brasidas and Cleon had been killed in battle, 422 BC, Athens authorized Nicias to sue for peace. Sanford's Mediterranean World, Chapter 13, page 220 to 221. It is obvious from a study of the causes and effects of the Peloponnesian Wars that A. The Greek states were envious of each other, and B. The desire for power and expansion led to constant aggression and warfare among themselves, and C. The condition of constant warfare between the city-states was unfavorable for the production of philosophers. Before passing on to consider my next proposition, I would like to say that it is an accepted truth that the development of philosophical thought requires an environment which is free from disturbance and worries. The period commonly assigned to Greek philosophy, i.e., Theos to Aristotle, was exactly the opposite to one of peace and tranquility, and therefore it cannot be expected to produce philosophy. The obstacles against the origin and development of Greek philosophy were not only the frequency of civil wars and a constant defense against Persian aggression, but also the threat of extermination from the Athenian government, its worst enemy. D. Philosophy requires a suitable environment. I must now add the following quotation which depicts this period. For although the natural ills that best mankind are many, we ourselves have added to them by wars and civil strife against one another, so that some have been unjustly put to death in their own cities, others driven into exile with their wives and children, and many have been compelled for the sake of their daily bread to die fighting against their own people for the sake of the enemy, by Isocrates. Botsford and Robinson's Hellenic History, Chapter 13. Couch's History of Greece, Chapter 22. Barry's History of Greece, Chapter 10. The Tutorial History of Greece by W.J. Woodhouse, Chapter 27, 28, and 29. End of Part 1 to Stolen Legacy by George G.M. James. The Egyptian Origins of Western Philosophy. Part 2 will deal with Chapter 3, 4, and 5. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and support me and my channel. Peace be to the gods on earth. Thank you for tuning in.